These days, we've got a lot of sampling groove boxes to choose from, and a super underrated one, in my opinion, is the Novation Circuit Rhythm. It's gone from being a device that I quite like, but didn't use all the time, to an indispensable piece of my live setup along with the circuit tracks, but it is fully capable of shaking a dance floor just on its own. So that's what I want to explore today. All right, to start off, I'm going to play through the music itself, and then we'll dive into the production. So at this point, I've been playing a bunch of like 150 BPM, 160 BPM techno stuff, and then we're going to transition into drum and bass.
Set up right under Arasaka's windows and crank it loud. Crank it loud.
So let's start this off by showing you the kind of main project that everything branches out from, and then I'll go into how I do some of the transitions and stuff like that. So you've heard this. Let's start off with the drums, which immediately shows a couple of things I like about the circuit rhythm. So let me get rid of this distortion here. That's my original sounds, and then if I mute everything once again, I love this distortion. It goes such a long way towards letting you use one sound for multiple different purposes, and I find it sounds really nice, and I find it incredibly useful. I also have this sent to the reverb a little bit, like the tiniest amount. So the other thing that you may have noticed is that I have two sounds running on this one track. The big limitation of the circuit rhythm, other than the amount of sample time you can fit into it, is the fact that each track can only play one sound at a time. But you get around this by being able to switch between sounds. And I'll be real with you, this takes patience in order to really figure out how to Tetris all the sounds that you want into your 8 tracks if you're able to swap between sounds. So I'm having my clap and kick, and then later on my snare and kick on track 1, because I want both the kick and the snare to trigger the sidechain. And I've got limited tracks to work with, and all of these are kind of spoken for. I've basically maxed out my tracks, and you'll see that in a second. I am also In addition to switching between samples, switching between which note each sample is playing, because I wanted my kick and my snare to both hit at certain pitches, which are different from what the original samples were. Because usually when I load samples into this thing, I just load samples that I think I'll find useful and don't worry too much about what key they're in and just figure it out by ear later on. And so I'm basically able to select any step and select which note that plays. And once I've got these two steps created, where I've locked the sample to each step and I've set the pitch on both steps, I can just duplicate these. And they'll retain all of that information, which is pretty nice. That also works for step automation. So if I want to automate this distortion, say, I'm going to say, I like where the distortion is parked right now. So I'm gonna hit record, hold down the step that I want to do step automation on, and I'm just going to twiddle this slightly till it lights up red. Now, this is locked with that amount of distortion. Let's say I want to turn it all the way down for the next step. But let's say I want my kicks to always be that distorted. I can just duplicate the step that has the automation on it. And you'll notice it'll just retain whatever the last setting was. So then theoretically I could duplicate this. That maybe feels a bit cumbersome, and I fully understand if that workflow is not for everyone. But for me personally, I've gotten really fast with this, and the way it's laid out, I personally find very intuitive. And so getting pretty surgical with your use of the step sequencer starts to feel really hands-on and second nature. If, that is, your brain happens to just gel with the way this device is laid out, which for me, that's the case. For other people, maybe not so much, which I totally get. So that's our kick and snare. Simpler track here. Just switching back and forth between two different sounds. Ride cymbal, sent to the reverb a little bit. I am also using slope to have that sample fade out more sharply. And that's one of the other things I find really nice about the circuit rhythm. You can take a limited pool of sounds. I've loaded in a bunch of one-shots into this, and then shape them depending on the situation that you want to use them in. So this sample is all over the place in this live set, and I just keep like reshaping it in different ways to fit with the track I'm using it for. You can hear that versus that. Up next, let me show you what this originally sounded like. So then we pitch it down an octave. And that's pretty heavily artifacted, so hey, let's just cover it up. Distort to hell and back. And then I don't want this clogging up on my low end, so I'll cut a bunch of low end. That's what it sounds like dry. Add some reverb and delay. And sidechain it to the kick and snare very heavily. This sub bass is fun. That's what it used to sound like. So we just distort it. And these elements fit together quite nicely. And I've just got this rolling bass line very persistently throughout this entire drum and bass segment. Emphasize some hits. I usually like to have a dedicated track near the end of the list that's just my various little pockets of sound track is the way I like to think of it. So wait for it. So you can hear I'm messing with which note these are playing, and I'm switching between multiple samples. And one really nice thing is that the reverb and delay here are doing a lot of work for me to kind of cover up the fact that I'm stacking this many sounds onto one track. Like some of these samples have their own reverb, but it might get cut off. It might not sound right. But now I can have this reverb and delay tail fade into itself when new samples are triggered. This is also distorted a bit. We have a lot of distortion going on this one. Same deal with this. Just a tiny little sample. I'm also cutting off the beginning a little bit, so let me distort this. Just to tighten it up a bit. Let me show you the difference this track makes if I get rid of it. It seems like a waste of a track, but it goes such a long way towards filling this out and giving this a really frenetic feel, which I really like. And then the last track is for vocals. Provided by Nathan from The Relative Minimum, a progressive metal band who you should absolutely check out. He was kind enough to do some scream vocals for this, so then I'm just triggering those vocals and also distorting them a bit. Whoop, no. Okay, not that much. And triggering them at the appropriate times. Then I'm using scenes to switch between my different segments of music. So for this second scene, I'm switching between a bunch of different hi-hats, which sounds kind of bad on its own, but in context, I think it works. And then we get the master filter involved. And I'm basically just maxing out all of my patterns in order to get unique segments that I can then recombine into these scenes. And for this section here, let me mute the vocal for a second. I'm also using step automation to make this sample work in a couple of different contexts, because so far it's just been this long, drawn out barrel. But now, I want it to play that little melody, but I don't want it to ring out for too long. So I have automated the start of my sample to basically start kind of midway through the sample, and then when it needs to do the long, drawn-out blah part, the start switches back to be all the way at the beginning, so this sound rings out the way I want it to. So that's this project, and before I switch to the next one, I do want to just draw your attention to the fact that that's a thing I can do. I've talked about this many times before, and I'll probably talk about it more in depth again, but this is one of the big things that makes the circuits something I find indispensable for the way I like to make live electronic music. The ability to switch to a project as if it's a clip or a scene, and potentially have every single sound, parameter, and set of patterns switch out in an instant is crazy powerful, meaning that I can have as much or as little in common between projects as I want. The tempo will stay whatever I set it to be, and then I can either seamlessly or abruptly jump from thing to thing. And other devices have other ways of doing drastic, instantaneous switch-ups like this, but the circuit project switching will always hold a special place in my heart. So you've seen it in action a little bit, but just to quickly demonstrate. That's an entirely new collection of patterns, sounds, etc. So for an even more drastic example, that's a silly example because by default, that pattern is at 135, but hopefully you can see where I'm headed with that. And I've mentioned this before as well, but it's worth noting in this context that if these two devices are connected, you can switch projects at the same time on both devices. Anyway, so that's our first drum and bass project. Let's move on to the next project.
Set up right
With the Keanu Reeves sample from Cyberpunk 2077, which is kind of fun. Once again, just loaded into here. Nothing too crazy going on. I'm just using this track 8 for vocals again. And I'm also automating my sub bass. I could theoretically do that on the fly, but I will have just switched to this project, and so I want to have that go on in the background while I readjust what I'm about to do.
set up right under Arasaka's windows and crank it loud.
Then we drop. And once again, I have to get creative here with my track Tetris. So I have my kick, and then a snare stacked onto my hi-hat track. And in context, I think it works. Now, I understand that at this point, I'm probably not really selling you on the ability of this thing to be powerful if you have to use all these stupid workarounds. I understand that, but to be fair, I'm not trying to sell you anything other than sell you on my own ability to make cool stuff, hopefully. But what I really like about this thing is its flexibility. That's the big thing that I find incredibly useful. Like within this one set of projects, I've got all this techno stuff that I'm going to go into in a later video. Something a little different with a vocal. You get the idea. And being able to do that much with a fairly limited pool of sounds in what I have learned to find a fairly intuitive workflow is nice. And the problem solving does kind of light my brain up. All that being said, let's move on to a couple of transitions. So I've just got this here. Switch to new scene. These patterns chain together. So what I've done is automate the high cut filter or low pass filter on a couple of elements. Like my kick and snare. And then I'll use the master filter to cut some lows. And because I didn't want this to trigger the sidechain at a certain point, I have actually stacked onto the second track a bunch of kicks. That way it stops triggering the sidechain, but keeps the same kick sound. Sneaky. Same deal with teasing the second little bass line. Filtering that in. Give a little 1, 2, 3, 4, and then you go to the drop. This project is fundamentally constructed very similarly to the other one, so I'm not going to go into it too in depth, other than the fact that same kick, but a different snare, and I've tuned this kick differently because we're now in a different key. And I find that switching keys like this is not really much of a problem. It's maybe a tad abrupt. That's okay. So I've changed what key we're in right when that buildup starts, and I think that works fine. Lets you know something new is coming. So this is the only truly new element. You're a little delay on that track. So I'm basically switching between multiple different bass one-shots. That one's fun. Add a little reverb and delay. I didn't really even need to distort them in this case. That's too much delay. And then I've got the rolling bass line maintained as is. I could also have this follow those bass one shots, and you'll notice I've cut the built-in subs from those one shots. And that just drives everything forward really nicely. Same deal with this, where I'm basically just swapping out one of my main sounds and switching up the pattern a little bit. And then, once again, this is reserved for vocals, in this case, a rip of Kenya Grace's Strangers, because I thought that'd be kind of hype to drop in there. But there's one more puzzle piece, which is, okay, so you've gotten all of this drum and bass stuff going. How are you going to transition from hard techno to drum and bass? And the main thing that really helps me out here is the use of overlapping elements. This kick and siren stab thingy are the same as this track. So in this case, you can hear I've distorted this kick to hell and back. And then I've got that siren thing going. And then this is my transitional project. So that kick, that same kick is still going, and I'm about to get rid of all of its distortion. And then, of course, that siren is still also going. So watch the distortion closely here. And for anyone listening just over audio, I've basically, once we switch to that drum and bass pattern, cut all the distortion out in an instant. I've step automated it, so we go from super distorted kick to way less distorted kick instantaneously. that's the same kick sample, and so you've got the same kick, you've got the same siren sounds. I've introduced that new synth stab, and at this point, I've filtered down as well. So I'm going to cover up some of the changes. And we've got that build, and at this point in the hard techno thing, I would have built this up to closer to 170. And then I have just a couple bars to get this from 160 something to 170. And that's how I conceptualize a transition. I try to, when I'm adding new material, use overlapping sounds. So basically do a save as of the previous session and then start to just change everything but keep some things the same. And sometimes I'll work backwards where I've made two very separate things, and then I'll start inventing connective tissue to tie the two together. If you'd like to see a full recording of one iteration of my live set, you can check this video out up over here. And if you'd like to see the ins and outs of how I use the circuits together, you can check this video out down over here. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll be back with a new video in a little bit.